Hey, Mr. Udell here for those of you who could not be in class this week for whatever reason about the lesson that I've posted on the Google Doc for you about what a democracy is. So even if you were not in class, I think the day I was absent, you were here and I asked you to come up with this checklist of things about what you would find in a democracy. And the reason for doing that is that I then have you list the checklist and we actually try to come up with a definition for democracy, which is much, much harder than you would think it is. And I'm not going to walk you through all the steps, but I am going to get you to the point that is most important. And that is when it comes to democracy, it turns out there are two different definitions, and the definitions don't work well together, meaning, although they have to complement each other, it's sort of like oil and water. They don't actually completely work together, and they can be given kind of fancy names. And the first of those is called the procedural definition. Procedural, if I could spell. And procedural sounds like process. So when you ask what a democracy is, some people say, look, this is the easiest way to figure it out. You check the way they make decisions, or how do they make decisions, right? And this how, I should just put this on my screen, it'd be much easier. This how, I think most of you probably already know. No, that wasn't useful, was it? All right, try that again. So the how, we would say one, uh, do all people have a chance to vote? Right? So we call that universal participation. It can't be a vote of just the tribal elders or a vote of just the men or a vote of just these people. It's got to be everybody. Two, do all votes weigh equally? So, in other words, it's not one of these things like, okay, you all voted for the test Tuesday, but Mr. Udell voted Monday. And since his vote counts 50 times as much as yours, we're having it Monday. Now, I don't claim my class is a democracy, so that's okay. I can do crap like that. But if I were claiming it democracy, that would be unfair. And then the third thing is, does the majority rule? Right? So, in other words, these are the basics of a procedural definition of democracy. Abraham Lincoln has a funny one. He asked his whole cabinet if he should do something, and they all said, no, you shouldn't. And he said, well, 12 no's and one yes. The yeses have it. And again, his point is when he's running his cabinet, it's not a democracy. But if it was a democracy, he'd have to go with the 12. Now, there are all sorts of other things that you can put in here, but they all sort of come back to this. Like a lot of people said really good things like, if there are representatives, are they elected? Very good, right? So it's the same sort of thing, the majority ruling. Does the government do what the people want? Yes. In other words, are the people being changed out in this way? But here's the real problem. What if the people in this country vote to burn babies or they vote to make people slaves? Is it still a democracy? And some people sort of scratch their head and they say, well, you're losing freedom, but it sounds like democracy. And as a matter of fact, what that's called is it's called the paradox of democracy. And the paradox of democracy is John Locke taught us the whole reason we want a democracy is to protect natural rights. But what if we use this process that we call a fair process to do something that's unfair? How are we going to handle that? It doesn't sound very democratic anymore. So the other definition of democracy is substantive, which sounds like substance, which says in a democracy, are minority rights protected? So this seems to make sense, right? Are minority rights protected? Um, because if the majority is making people slaves or arbitrarily killing people or randomly taking away people's property in a what would be considered an unfair way, you would say, I don't care how you made that decision, you're still having a little problem with your democracy here, right? It's still not right. Now, you might say, well, then why don't you just use the substantive definition and not the procedural? And there are a couple of reasons. The first one is, what if I lived under a good dictator, meaning he had total control and he made all the decisions, but he always protected everybody's natural rights? Well, that might be a nice country to live in, but you wouldn't call it a democracy. Okay, so that's the one problem. Here's the second thing. Beyond some very basics, people get into arguments about what the actual rights that have to be protected are. There are many democracies around the world that say if you are a rich country and you don't give all your citizens health care, you're not really being a full democracy. Whereas in the United States, we'd say, no, you don't have to do that. At least now we would. So there's no actual full list of rights There are lots of countries around the world that don't have a Second Amendment and guarantee sort of a protection of firearms like we do here. But I don't think anybody's going to say they're not a democracy just because they don't have that. There are some people who are going to say, I don't want to live there because they don't have it. There are other people who are going to say they do want to live there because they don't have it. But because we can't agree on that list, then, meaning like uh, this definition becomes unclear. And then the problem is you want to go back to this because this is really clear. I get this, but I still need this. So the activity that I had students do in class is I had them go back to this circle diagram, and I had them label it for me, right? Go back in your notes, figure out what it is. Remember, in the middle it says the majority make the rules, and out here it's minority rights. And I made you do two things for me, and that was label the diagram. Where would the P definition of democracy go, and where would the S definition of democracy go? And then the second thing, which is a little harder, is see if you can figure out which part of this diagram actually is a little bit oversimplified to the point that it's making something that's not so easy seem easy. So if I were you, I would pause the video and try to figure that out yourself. Where does the letter P go and where does the letter S go? But if you're not going to pause it, I'm just going to go ahead and say, now, this part of the diagram right in the middle of the circle, that is procedural democracy, because that's the part of democracy where it says the majority makes the rules. Meaning, do they vote fairly? Does everybody's vote count? Does the majority make the rules? So that's the process. And then out here in the meat of the donut, we're going to say that's your substantive democracy, because that's where your natural rights are. Now, sometimes people get really caught up on the size of these circles and they'll say, oh, this has to be your rights because it's bigger. In this case, that has nothing to do with it. I could just arbitrarily draw these circles, and I could say one country has a giant majority rule in the middle and just fewer natural rights. It's still the same thing. This is still where the procedural democracy happens, and this is where the substantive democracy happens. All we're really talking about, the difference here is the difference in ideology. This thinks only a little bit of government control is reasonable. This thinks more government control is reasonable. It's just a difference in their social contract. Okay, now, as for the part of the diagram that's a little bit oversimplified, it works like this. If I want to say, can the government tell me to get married? Then you're going to say, clearly not. That goes out in your substantive democracy. That's your right. Nobody can tell you what to do. If I want to say, can the government stop me from marrying a 10-year-old? Then you're going to say, of course they can. That's in here. That's where the government may make a rule against things. But then if I wanted to ask something in the middle, like, can the government stop me from marrying my first cousin? You might be like, that sounds weird to me, but I don't know if that's in the government's power, if it's your right to choose. And all of a sudden, what you figured out is this line that I draw here that makes it seem so clear that one side is here and one side is here actually probably looks more like this. Sort of some sort of dotted grayness that weaves in and out, where of course there are some things that are your right, and of course there are some things that are rules, but there are some things in between that we just can't tell. And that's sort of where procedural democracy meets substantive democracy. So the example I have been using with kids all week is there's this very unusual church group called the Westboro Baptist Church. They believe that America's soldiers are being killed because our country is too tolerant of homosexual people. So what they do is they go to the funerals of fallen soldiers and they hold up big signs that says, thank God for dead soldiers, God hates fags. And the question is that their free speech? And everybody scratches their head and says, oh my God, that's terrible. Who would say that? But is it their right to say it? Or wait a minute, we can protect the family of a fallen soldier and make a rule against that? And the answer is it's in this gray area. And we will not know the answer to that till the Supreme Court says. So in other words, there's no book where you can look it up and say, this is exactly the answer. We have to figure that answer out. So how do we define democracy? It has to include both these parts. And obviously, it's also a process of figuring out which part goes where. So if you wanted the shortest, snappiest definition of democracy, it would be this. Democracy is a country with majority rule and minority rights. And we're saying, well, what does that really mean? What it means is that a democracy is a country where when there are difficult decisions to be made, we allow all the citizens to vote, we count their votes equally, and the majority of them win. But at the same time, we have a certain area of people's lives where the majority or nobody else can tell people what to do. And there is an unclear line between those two things, right? Because when procedural democracy goes too far, we say it's into minority rights. When people's rights, when we claim they have too many rights, we claim that's getting into the area that we should have rule. So it's this unsteady balance between majority rule and minority rights. Okay, so that's what we got going on for that lesson. Obviously, you can ask me questions later, and that's it for now.